Thanks for joining me once again as we talk about game design. So far we've talked a lot about the mechanics side of game design, but there is this other area, that of the story, the plot, the narrative. If you remember 3 to 15 and Tic-Tac-Toe, those are mechanically the same game in the abstract. Their different themings made them feel very different to play, though. Or if you prefer, you could take a high fantasy game with dragons and wizards and fireballs and retheme it to science fiction, where instead of dragons there are giant battlecruiser spaceships. Instead of wizards throwing fireballs, you have aliens with laser weapons. And it all works the same, but it can feel different. So let's talk about story.
As I've said before, games are an interactive medium. The concept of player choices and decision-making are what generally define games as distinct from things like books or movies. You might think that telling stories in games needs special techniques to make the stories interactive and make sure that players have choice, not just in the mechanics, but in the narrative too. And we do have techniques for that. We'll cover those in the next module, but many games have linear stories and focus on decisions with mechanics alone, and even with stories that have choice, each of those choice paths still has to make sense as a linear story. So to understand all that, you have to understand the fundamentals of storytelling in general. As far as writing stories go, one of the longest lasting books is Poetics by Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. So we're talking about a book that's very, very old, and unless you speak ancient Greek, if you were going to read this, you would need to find a translation to read it. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with poetry. It's about writing stories, specifically stories that take place in the real world, can still be fiction, but nothing supernatural. You've probably heard some of the advice that comes from this before. If you've ever heard, a story is supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, that was from Poetics. Really what he meant by beginning, middle, and end is to introduce the concept of the 3-act story structure, which is common in stories even today. Basically, in the first act, you introduce what's going on in the world, the setting, the important characters, and it ends with the main conflict of the story identified and the audience understanding what this story is going to be about. It's usually about the first quarter of the story in length. Act 2 is the largest portion, about half the length of the story, and involves the main character struggling with the main conflict, whatever it is, and ends when the main character finally realizes what they have to do to resolve it. In Act 3, the last quarter of the story, the conflict is resolved one way or another. Either the main character permanently fixes the problem, or is somehow maneuvered into a situation where the problem can never be fixed. I've heard this described before as, in Act 1 you get the hero up a tree, in Act 2 you throw rocks at them, and in Act 3 they come down. Another thing Aristotle complained about with the stories of his day is that so often you'd see this unrelated series of events. This happens, and then that happens, and that other thing happens. It happens in time order, but there's no connection, there's no cause and effect, and that generally feels like weak writing when it happens. Tends to create a much stronger story if individual scenes logically follow each other. This happens, and then because of that, this other thing happens, and then as a consequence of that, this other thing happens. This is especially important for the protagonist, the main character of the story. Ideally, everything that happens to the main character should be caused by that character's choices. The main character takes an action, and then the audience gets to see the plausible and inevitable result of that action. It helps the audience to pity and empathize with the hero, because if something bad happens to the hero, it's because they displayed human weakness, of a kind that we as the audience can appreciate as fellow humans ourselves. We might not personally like or agree with what the hero did, but we can at least understand why they did it and how it led to a bad outcome. Aristotle really hated Deus ex machina endings. That literally means God by machine, because a lot of ancient Greek stage plays would end Act 2 with the hero in some kind of apparently untenable position, where the audience would wonder, okay, how can they possibly get out of this? And then the stagehands would move this image of a Greek god on a crane to fly over the stage and magically fix everything because they're a god and they can do that. Even if we don't have a literal god on a literal machine, today there are still plenty of stories today that end this way too. Think if you can remember any stories that ended with the hero about to be defeated and then some other super strong character came out of nowhere and saved them. Or any stories that had the hero in a really bad place and then they woke up and it was all just a bad dream. And you can see why Aristotle hated this Deus ex machina ending so much. because the hero had absolutely nothing to do with the resolution of the main conflict. The hero isn't the cause of the ending. They have no control and no agency over the story of what happens to them and those around them. You can see two applications of this in games. One is just don't end your game with lazy writing, but the other is that this explains why it can be so frustrating as a player when something big happens in a non-interactive cutscene, like a major character dying. Right? The one time that you as a player don't have any choice or any agency, that's the one time that the plot advances, and since you are supposedly the one controlling the main character, it can feel a bit like you've been cheated. The last big takeaway I want to mention from Poetics is that Aristotle defined a stage play, he was writing about stage plays, as having these 6 elements. And he was specifically writing about stories and stage plays here, not other media like books or games or movies, but you'll see that a lot of these carry over between different media. So the first is plot, which is basically what we think of as the story, the narrative that describes what actually happens. The next is theme. That's the why, the meaning behind it all. What is the audience supposed to take away from this experience? Why did this happen? What's the message? Then there are the characters, as in all of the individual roles within the story. It's pretty straightforward. Diction is the word he used for the spoken dialogue of the characters. And for stage plays, this includes both the words themselves and also the actor's delivery of those words.
Close your heart to it.
Rhythm is a strange word to use here since there isn't necessarily any music, but he was referring to the rhythm of human speech, like the patterns of what syllables are stressed or unstressed that can make normal speech feel more like song. If you've heard rap music, that's a great example of how spoken language can have a rhythm to it, even if there aren't any musical instruments involved. Poetry often does this too. And lastly, spectacle, which is the word he used to describe basically special effects and eye candy. Yeah, so in ancient Greece, they didn't exactly have massive explosions or holograms or lasers or anything, but they did still have their own version of what we might call special effects today. And Aristotle totally was complaining thousands of years ago that too many plays were all spectacle and nothing else, and warned against that. So today we would probably say, don't expect to hide a bad game and a bad story behind really cool graphics. It will not save you. So that brings us to this other book, Story, which is more or less a retelling of Poetics, but written today for screenwriters who are writing scripts to movies. Since Story wasn't written 2,000 years ago, and it references movies you might have actually heard of, it's a lot easier to read than Poetics. So you don't have to read either one of these, but if you had to read one of the two, I'd go for Story. It's much easier, it's more immediately useful. It is a big book, but it's written in a conversational style, so it's not as hard to read. One of the things the author says over and over again is that writing a story is not about following a formula, it's about understanding common forms. You don't write a stage play or a movie by filling in the blanks in a template, but you should understand the commonalities between different stories so that you can make one that is unique. The general form that most stories take goes something like this. First, there's some kind of inciting incident that happens, basically the event that kicks off the main conflict. This is where the protagonist, the main character, realizes that they have a goal of some kind. Then the protagonist tries to reach that goal, but a gap opens up. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a physical gap, it could be, but usually just means they run into some kind of obstacle that prevents them from immediately reaching their goal. Next, the protagonist tries to cross that gap. That is, they come up with a plan to remove the obstacle or work around it so that they can reach the goal anyway. And when they put that plan into action, one of two things happens. Either they fail because the gap was actually a bit bigger than they realized, so their plan doesn't work, or, and then they have a larger gap to deal with, or they succeed and a new obstacle appears. And we keep going like this, with the main character crossing gaps or failing to cross gaps and having to reassess in order to cross it again, and then the gaps continuing to widen or new ones appearing until the protagonist reaches the final gap, the final challenge, and then irreversibly either crosses it and completes their goal, or it becomes clear that the final gap can never be crossed and they have permanently failed. In either case, the main conflict is resolved and the story ends. And in a typical 3-act structure, there are 2 new gaps that appear, which are called reversals between the act. So one reversal at the end of Act 1 and another reversal at the end of Act 2. Another big point made in this book is that stories are at their heart about change. Every scene in a story should end in a different state than it began, and if you have a scene where nothing has changed, consider removing it from your story. Think of it like this. Imagine if someone was going to make a 2-hour movie about your life so far. Yes, your personal life. You've been alive for longer than 2 hours, so some things have happened to you that would not be shown, at least not in real time. But if you think about it, an awful lot of our lives are really just grind anyway. If you were making this movie of your life, would you really show the boring parts that are the same every day? Or the parts where something big happens and changes in your life? Probably you'd show the changes, and the audience can assume that everything in between scenes is boring normal stuff. And this explains why some games can create very strong emergent narratives, even if they don't have a strong embedded story. Because games are about players making decisions that cause a change in the game state. Games have an uncertain outcome, and it's only at the end of the game that the goal of the game is met or not met in some kind of irreversible manner, right? All of the elements of a story exist in the play of a game. Now, McKee in this book also makes a distinction between character and characterization. Here we're talking about the nature of what makes one of the characters in the story who they are and distinct from all the other characters. What he calls characterization are the surface elements. How tall a person is, what do they look like, what color is their hair, how much can they bench press, what stats would be on their character sheet. You might need to know this stuff, but it doesn't really tell you much about who they are. What McKee calls their character, as in their moral character. The character of a person isn't something you can tell the audience. It's something you have to show them. If someone is the type of person who would willingly run into a burning building to save a baby, even though they're risking their own life, you have to actually put them in that situation and show the audience that they do it. You could say that you're the type of person who'd go into that building, but until you actually do, it's just talk. So with character, to show character, you have to actually put the person in conflict that forces them to show that character. Now, this gets a bit harder with games. There are two ways to show a thing, either during a non-interactive cutscene, where the player has no agency, or in gameplay, where the player is making the decisions. If it happens in a cutscene, you can certainly show a person's character, their moral character, but that also means the player isn't in control of the story, even though they're supposed to be controlling the main character. So there is an internal conflict there. If it happens during play, though, then the player can choose what kind of character the protagonist has. But there's still a disconnect between the protagonist and the player because the stakes are different. For the protagonist inside the game, the choice they're making may be one of life and death, but in the real world, the human player isn't under a real threat at all. This is play. It's only a game. The player is safe. They have nothing in the real world to lose, so the player is not making choices that reflect their own personal character, which makes it really obvious that there's a gap between the player and the protagonist, and it reminds the player that they are not actually the same as the character they're controlling. So we end up with the same core problem as if things happen during a cutscene, right? Player does not feel like they are character. Now, another book that most game writers are familiar with is Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. This one is a little bit different than the other two in that it is a study specifically about hero stories that appear in myths and legends across cultures, looking at commonalities between all these different stories. This is definitely not a perfect work, but it does provide a form for this kind of story, which he calls the monomyth or the hero's journey. And it starts with the protagonist as an everyday person, not a hero yet, just in an everyday person in an everyday world, when they receive some kind of call to adventure, a reason to leave their normal life. They may or may not accept this call. They might reject it. If they do reject the call to adventure, then circumstances will force them to go on the journey anyway, such as maybe they hide in their homeland, and then their homeland is attacked and forces them to flee for their lives. Then they meet up with some other characters, often one of them is a mentor, who may give them gifts or assistance to help them on their journey. The protagonist then crosses a threshold or a barrier. This may be a physical barrier or just a metaphor, but it represents a change from leaving their known world to the unknown. Sometimes it symbolizes the transition between the living world and the underworld of death and decay. The threshold is often guarded by some kind of guardian, which must be defeated or otherwise bypassed. After crossing that first barrier, the protagonist then goes through what is called the Trail of Trials, a series of challenges leading them on their quest. Often they'll meet other archetypal characters, some helpful, some not. They may meet a mentor, they may meet a trickster or temptress that may cause them to go the wrong way or fall into a trap. The important thing in this section is that the protagonist isn't just overcoming challenges, they're actually growing as a person and becoming an actual hero. This doesn't just mean leveling up with experience points and cool loot drops. It means the main character understanding that their quest is bigger than they are, and that despite them being only one person and relatively powerless, they are representing the hopes and dreams of everyone else that they know and love. And they are performing acts of selflessness and putting themselves in danger because there are things more important than their own personal safety. These trials then prepare them for an ultimate confrontation. And at the end, the protagonist, who has now grown into a true hero, confronts the great evil, triumphs over it, and takes the prize that they came for. This prize might be an actual trophy or magical artifact or powerful object, could be a person they're rescuing, or it might be something more abstract like a piece of knowledge. Then at this point, the hero still has to get out and return with the prize to their home. They are now greater than they were. They've transformed into a hero, but they still have to get back, and that's not always trivial. If they've made compromises, bargains, or other mistakes along the way to get to where they are, this is where they have to pay their dues. When they return across the barrier into their original world, they may face a second guardian, though they are now a hero and able to pass, and they finally return to the living world, their original home, with the prize that improves the life of everyone around them. The others from their normal world are still as they were, but the hero has grown, they have changed, and will never be the same again. And that is the journey, the transformation and change from an everyday person into a hero, and the nature of that change is what drives that story. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is an overall form, and it is specific to hero stories. This is not a template or formula where you can just fill in the blanks. This is just a set of common elements of hero stories, but it is important, if you're writing one, to understand what purpose each element has, what it symbolizes, and how it fits to support the overall narrative so that you can understand how it would or wouldn't work for your story. And again, keep in mind, this is only for stories about heroes, which are common in games, which is why we reference Campbell a lot, but not all stories are about heroes, so it may not even be appropriate to your project. With all that said, we do still have to remember that we are making games here. If you just want to write stories, that's great. Go write a short story, or a novel, or a stage play, or a film script. But if you are writing for games, remember that your story is probably going to be secondary to the gameplay. So while the story is the central focus of something like a movie or a novel, it's really just playing a supporting role in most games. And since games, again, are interactive and involve player choice and agency, some of the traditional advice for writing stories kind of falls apart. Like, poetics and story both say that a story has a beginning, middle, and an end. But in games there might be multiple beginnings, multiple middles, multiple ends, and they might be told out of order. The 3-act structure works great for a 2-hour movie or play, but might not be appropriate for a 10-minute board game, a years-long tabletop RPG campaign, or an 80-hour console video game. The hero's journey is limited to hero stories, so it's not even useful if you're telling a different kind of story. This might feel demoralizing. Here we have all this advice on how to write stories, and we can't even use it in games? But it is still useful. We have to start somewhere, and understanding what makes good stories in other media provides a useful starting point. And for many games, we do tell a completely linear, traditional story, and the gameplay is what draws the player through that story, so in those games this is very applicable. For games where the player has some agency over the story, well, we'll talk about that in the next module. So while I quoted from 3 books here on traditional storytelling, I'm not going to actually recommend those books here. If you do go on to become a professional writer, you will probably encounter them and be forced to read them in school anyway. But at this point in your design journey, they're all a bit heavy and more of a time investment than you need right now. But do keep them in mind for later. For the time being, though, there are some shorter things I can point you to. The first 2 links here are summaries of the hero's journey and McKee's story as applied to game writing specifically. They're both just a few pages. The third one is different, a bit different. It's a critique of an older game, the original BioShock, and specifically how the message of narrative conflicts with the message of the mechanics of the game. There is a term for this, ludonarrative dissonance, and in fact that term was coined by this article, which is why I include it. Now obviously BioShock was a very successful and influential game, but the takeaway here is that you do want to think about not just your story on its own, but specifically how the story interacts with your gameplay and your mechanics.
There are a lot of ways that the story can either support or conflict with the gameplay. Are the most dramatic elements of your story happening during the most intense parts of the gameplay, or are those different? Do the themes of the gameplay and the story support each other? this is something you want to at least be thinking about as you write the story for a game. And with that, I'll remind you once again to take your assessment so you can get your certification from HP Gaming Garage, and I'll see you next time when we talk about interactive narrative.